In the heartland of Missouri, 1879, a pregnant widow named Willa Harper stumbled into an abandoned barn, running from in-laws who wanted to steal her unborn child. She thought she was alone in her darkest hour, seeking nothing more than shelter from the storm that had become her life. But fate had other plans. Jack Maddox, a broken-down cowboy with his own troubled past, had been sleeping in that same barn's loft, hiding from demons that wouldn't let him rest. When morning came and Willa's labor pains began, this stranger didn't run. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and stayed. What started as two lost souls sharing shelter became something neither expected, a chance at the love they'd both given up hoping for. But when Willa's past catches up and Jack's enemies come calling, their fragile sanctuary faces destruction. Would their newfound love survive when the shadows of their former lives threaten to tear them apart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Willa Harper first saw the weathered outline of the barn through the gray Missouri twilight. Her hands, swollen and trembling, gripped the reins of the borrowed mare that had carried her this far from the life she'd known. The weight of her unborn child pressed against her ribs, a constant reminder of both hope and desperation that had driven her to flee in the dark of night. She remembered the way her mother-in-law's eyes had gleamed when she'd spoken of the child, not with the warmth of a grandmother's love, but with the cold calculation of someone who saw opportunity in grief. "This baby carries the Harper name," Margaret Harper had declared, her voice sharp as winter wind. "It belongs with us, where it can be raised properly. You're nothing but a farm girl who got lucky once. That luck's run out." The mare stumbled slightly on the muddy ground, and Willa winced as another contraction tightened across her belly. They'd been coming more frequently since dawn, a relentless rhythm that told her the baby wouldn't wait much longer. Her cousin Sarah's letter had promised sanctuary, a small cabin near Millerville where Willa could start over, raise her child in peace. But Sarah hadn't been at the meeting place, and now night was falling with nowhere else to turn. The barn stood like a tired sentinel against the storm, its wood silvered with age and weather. One side sagged where time had warped the beams, but it offered shelter, and that was more than she'd had in days. Willa slid from the mare's back, her legs nearly buckling as her feet touched the ground. The simple gold band on her finger, all that remained of her marriage to Thomas, caught what little light filtered through the clouds. She pushed through the barn's heavy door, breathing in the scent of old hay and rain-soaked timber. The space felt vast and empty, filled with shadows that seemed to move in the lamplight from her small lantern. Exhaustion pulled at her bones as she led the mare inside, her movements slow and careful. It was then she heard it, a soft rustling from the loft above, like someone shifting in sleep. Willa froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't alone. A man's voice drifted down, rough with sleep and weariness. "Easy there. I'm not looking for trouble." A figure appeared at the edge of the loft, silhouetted against the deeper darkness above. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to being unwelcome, climbing down the ladder with worn boots that had seen too many miles. In the lamplight, she could make out a face weathered by sun and hardship, eyes that held the kind of weariness that came from disappointment stacked upon disappointment. "Name's Jack Maddox," he said, keeping his distance but ready to help if she needed it. "Been sleeping rough up there for a few days. Didn't expect company." Another contraction seized her then, stronger than before, and Willa doubled over with a gasp that echoed through the barn. When she looked up, Jack was closer, his weathered saddlebags slung over one shoulder, concern replacing wariness in his expression. "Ma'am, are you—" He stopped, taking in her condition with the quick assessment of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize crisis when it appeared. "When did the pains start?" "This morning," she managed between shallow breaths. "Maybe earlier. I've been traveling since—" Another contraction cut off her words, and she gripped the nearest post for support. Jack set down his saddlebags and moved with surprising gentleness for a man of his size. "We need to get you settled. Baby's not going to wait for better circumstances." In the hours that followed, Jack Maddox proved himself to be exactly what Willa needed. Steady hands in crisis, quiet competence when everything else fell apart. He built a fire in the old brazier someone had left behind, boiled water in a dented pot from his few possessions, and created a makeshift bed from clean hay and the spare blanket he carried. As dawn broke grey and misty over the Missouri countryside, Willa Harper gave birth to her daughter in that abandoned barn, with only a stranger's kindness to see her through. Jack held the baby while Willa recovered, his calloused hands impossibly gentle as he cleaned and wrapped the tiny girl in the soft shirt from his own pack. "She's beautiful," he said softly, placing the baby in Willa's arms. "Strong, like her." "Mama." Willa looked up at this man who'd stayed when he could have run, who'd helped when he owed her nothing. In his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected to find again. The possibility of goodness in a world that had shown her mostly hardship. "I'm Willa," she said simply. "Willa Harper. And this is—" She paused, realizing she'd never spoken the name aloud. "This is Hope." Jack smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Hope's a fine name, a good omen. Outside, the rain had stopped, and thin sunlight filtered through the barn's gaps and cracks. Neither of them spoke of what came next, but something had shifted in that dawn light. Two strangers who'd found each other in desperate circumstances now faced the uncertain future with a fragile new life between them. Jack's saddlebags lay open beside the makeshift bed, revealing the worn contents of a man traveling light. Few clothes, some coins, letters tied with faded ribbon that he quickly tucked away when he noticed her looking. Whatever past he was running from, it had stripped him down to essentials, just as her own flight had done. "I can't pay you," Willa said quietly. "For helping, I mean. I don't have much of anything." Jack was cleaning up, moving with the efficient economy of someone used to making do. Didn't ask for payment. Sometimes folks just need help, that's all. But Willa could see the careful way he counted his remaining coins, the practiced manner in which he rationed what little food he had. This man was as broke and desperate as she was, yet he'd shared what he had without hesitation. "The baby and I need shelter for a while," she said, testing the words. "Maybe we could, that is if you're staying anyway." Jack paused in his cleaning, studying her face. "You sure about that? You don't know anything about me?" "I know you stayed," Willa replied simply. "I know you helped when you could have walked away. That tells me what I need to know." Something passed between them then, an understanding that went deeper than words. They were both running from something, both carrying wounds that hadn't healed. But in this abandoned barn, with a newborn baby as witness to their unexpected meeting, they'd found something neither had been looking for, a reason to stop running, at least for a while. Jack nodded slowly. "Reckon we could make this work for a time. Place seems sturdy enough, and nobody's come around asking questions." As the day wore on, they fell into an easy rhythm of shared responsibility. Jack tended the fire and saw to the mare while Willa rested and nursed the baby. They spoke little, but their movements around each other were careful and respectful, two people learning to share space who understood the value of not asking too many questions about the past. By evening, as they sat by the fire with Hope sleeping between them, Willa realized that for the first time in months she felt something approaching peace. The barn that had seemed like a last resort now felt like possibility, a place where two broken people might piece together something resembling a life. Jack stared into the flames, his weathered face thoughtful. "Storms passed," he observed, quietly. Willa looked toward the door, where the last light of day filtered through gaps in the wood. "Yes," she agreed, "I think it has." Neither spoke of the storms that might still be coming, or the past that had driven them both to seek shelter in this forgotten place. But as night settled over their unlikely sanctuary, something new was beginning, fragile as hope itself, but real enough to build on. 5 days had passed in their makeshift sanctuary when the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful rhythm Willa and Jack had established. It was mid-afternoon, and Willa was nursing hope in the soft light that filtered through the barn's weathered boards when Jack's entire body went rigid with tension. He'd been mending a bridle near the door, but now he moved with the fluid alertness of a man accustomed to danger. In one smooth motion, he was on his feet, positioning himself between Willa and the entrance while peering through a gap in the wood. "Stay quiet," he murmured, his voice carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. "Keep the baby calm if you can." Through the crack, Willa could see a lone rider approaching, a heavy-set man on a well-fed bay horse, his clothes marking him as someone who made his living on the road. A traveling merchant, perhaps, or a man who dealt in information as much as goods. Jack's jaw tightened as the stranger drew closer. "Afternoon in there," the man called out, his voice jovial, but carrying the practiced charm of someone used to talking his way into places he wasn't necessarily welcome. "Saw smoke from your fire. Name's Curtis Briggs. Mind if I water my horse? And maybe share your warmth for a spell?" Jack remained motionless for a long moment, clearly debating whether to respond. Finally, he called back, "Horse can drink from the trough outside. Fire's not much to speak of." Briggs chuckled, already dismounting. "Much obliged. Been riding since dawn, and this old back ain't what it used to be." The man led his horse to the trough, but Willa could see him studying the barn with more interest than someone simply seeking rest. His eyes lingered on the small signs of habitation, the thin trail of smoke, the way the door sat slightly ajar, the fresh tracks in the mud around the entrance. "Mighty nice setup you got here," Briggs continued, his voice carrying easily through the afternoon air. "Man could live comfortable in a place like this, I'd wager, private-like, nobody asking questions." Jack's hand had moved to rest near the knife at his belt, though he kept the gesture casual. "Just passing through," he replied, evenly. "Oh, I understand completely," Briggs said, and something in his tone made Willa's skin crawl. "Sometimes a man needs to lay low for a while. Wait for things to blow over, if you catch my meaning." The merchant approached the barn door with the confidence of someone who'd made this play before. "Mind if I step inside? Getting a mite chilly out here, and I've got something that might interest you." Before Jack could refuse, Briggs pushed through the door, his eyes adjusting quickly to the barn's interior. Willa saw the exact moment his gaze found her and the baby, saw the calculating look that crossed his features as he took in the scene. Well, he said softly. "Looks like you've got yourself quite the family situation here, friend." Jack stepped sideways, keeping himself between Briggs and Willa. "The lady's recovering from childbirth. She needs rest, not company." "I'm sure she does," Briggs agreed, but his attention had shifted to Jack with renewed interest. He reached into his coat with deliberate slowness, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Funny thing about faces, though. Sometimes they stick with you, even when you'd rather forget them." He unfolded the paper with a flourish, revealing a wanted poster that had seen better days. The drawing was rough, but recognizable. Jack's face, staring back from the yellowed paper, younger but unmistakably him. Willa's blood ran cold as she read the words beneath. "Wanted, Jack Maddox, cattle rustling, $500 reward." "Now, I'm not one to cause trouble for folks who are just trying to get by," Briggs continued, his voice taking on the smooth cadence of a man moving in for a deal. "But $500 is a lot of money. Man could live comfortable for quite a while on that kind of reward." Jack's face had gone stone still, but Willa could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "That poster's old news. Case was settled years ago." "Oh, I'm sure it was," Briggs said with mock sympathy. "But see, thing about wanted posters is they tend to stick around longer than the truth. Sheriff in the next county over, he's the type who'd pay first and ask questions later. Especially for a man traveling with a woman and baby. Makes for a real touching story when he tells it to the newspapers." Willa felt hope stir against her chest and forced herself to keep breathing steadily. Every instinct told her that Jack was innocent of whatever that poster claimed, but Briggs clearly didn't care about innocence or guilt. He cared about profit. "What do you want?" Jack asked quietly. Briggs smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Like I said, I'm not unreasonable. Maybe we could work out an arrangement. I've got expenses, you understand. Horse needs feed, I need supplies. Say $50 a month and I forget I ever saw you. Seems fair, considering the alternative." $50, Jack repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "To start. These things have a way of getting more expensive over time." Briggs tucked the poster back into his coat with satisfied confidence. "Take tonight to think it over. I'll be camping just down the road. Come find me tomorrow with an answer." He tipped his hat toward Willa with exaggerated courtesy. "Ma'am, hope you and the little one are feeling better real soon." With that, he strode out of the barn, leaving Jack and Willa alone with the weight of his threat hanging in the air. They listened to him mount up and ride away, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Only when silence returned did Jack finally move, sinking down onto a hay bale as if his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. He buried his face in his hands, and Willa could see the tremor in his shoulders. "Jack," she said softly. He looked up, and she was startled by the pain in his eyes. "I never rustled any cattle," he said simply, "but that doesn't matter now, does it?" Willa shifted hope to her shoulder and moved closer, settling beside him on the hay. "Tell me what happened." For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then the words came, slow and heavy with old grief. "Had a small spread down in Arkansas, nothing fancy, but it was mine. Worked 5 years to build it up, saved every penny to buy good breeding stock." He stared at his hands, calloused and scarred, from honest work. "My brother Marcus, he had bigger ideas, always did. Wanted me to partner with him on some scheme involving rustled cattle from the Indian Territory." Jack's voice grew quieter. "I told him no. Told him I'd earned what I had the hard way and wasn't about to lose it to his shortcuts. So he framed me instead, rustled those cattle himself and made sure the evidence pointed to me." "Your own brother," Willa breathed. "Blood doesn't always mean loyalty," Jack said bitterly. "By the time I figured out what he'd done, the law was already after me. Lost everything, the ranch, the cattle, any hope of clearing my name. Been running ever since." Willa reached out, covering his hand with hers. His skin was warm and rough. The hand of a man who'd worked hard all his life for what little he'd had. "How much money do you have?" she asked practically. Jack's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "About $12 and some change. Enough for maybe a week if we're careful. Then we can't pay him." "No," Jack agreed. "We can't." They sat in silence as the implications settled around them. Hope made small sounds against Willa's shoulder, innocent of the danger that now surrounded their fragile sanctuary. "You could run," Willa said finally. "Before morning. Take what you have and get as far away as possible." Jack turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. "Is that what you want me to do?" The question hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to name. In 5 days, this stranger had become her anchor in a world that had tried to sweep her away. He'd delivered her baby, shared his food, treated her with a kindness she'd almost forgotten existed. "No," she said simply, "but I won't ask you to stay if it means prison or worse." Jack was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving from her face to the baby in her arms. When he spoke again, his voice was steady with resolve. "I'm tired of running," he said. "Tired of looking over my shoulder. Tired of having nothing worth staying for. Maybe it's time I figured out how to fight instead." "We," Willa corrected softly. He looked at her with surprise. "Willa, you can't." "We're in this together now," she said firmly. "You didn't run when I needed help. I'm not running when you need it." Something shifted in Jack's expression, a vulnerability that made her chest tighten. "You don't know what you're saying. Briggs isn't going to just disappear if we ask him nicely. Then we'll have to be smarter than he is." As evening settled over their sanctuary, they began to plan. The wanted poster might be old, but it was real enough to destroy them both if Briggs carried through on his threat. They needed to find a way to discredit him, or better yet, turn his own greed against him. Men like Briggs always have enemies. Willa observed as they shared a meager supper. Nobody gets that comfortable with extortion without making mistakes along the way. Jack nodded thoughtfully. Question is, how do we find out what mistakes he's made without showing our hand? They talked long into the night, weighing options and discarding plans that seemed too risky or unlikely to work. But as the fire burned, low and hope slept peacefully between them, Willa felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the strength that came from not facing trouble alone. Whatever happened tomorrow, they would meet it together. It was a fragile hope, built on trust that was still new and untested, but it was more than either of them had possessed just days before, and it would have to be enough. Dawn came too soon, grey and uncertain, with the kind of mist that clung to the ground and made everything seem insubstantial. Willa woke to find Jack already moving quietly around their makeshift camp, his movements economical and purposeful. He'd let the fire burn down to coals, she noticed, and his few possessions were arranged as if he might need to leave quickly. This sight sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. Second thoughts, she asked softly, not wanting to wake Hope, but needing to know where she stood. Jack looked up from where he was checking his saddlebags, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Every minute since Briggs rode away, he admitted, but not about staying, about what comes next. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by the weight of their situation. In the harsh light of morning, their plan from the night before seemed fragile as spun glass. They were going to try to turn Briggs's greed against him, but they had precious little to work with. No money, no connections, and no knowledge of what leverage the man might have used on others. "I've been thinking," Jack continued, settling beside her near the dying fire, "about what you said last night. Men like Briggs making enemies." Willa shifted Hope to her other arm, marveling again at how naturally this tiny life had fitted into their strange circumstances. "You have an idea?" "Maybe. There's a town about 8 miles east of here, Millerville. Not much to speak of, but it's got a sheriff and a general store. If Briggs has been working this territory for any length of time, someone there might know him. That's a risk." Willa pointed out. "Going into town, questions?" Jack nodded grimly. "Everything's a risk now. But sitting here waiting for him to come back with a posse isn't much of a strategy either." She studied his face, noting the way his jaw set when he'd made a difficult decision. In the days she'd known him, she'd learned to read these small signs. The tightening around his eyes when he was worried. The careful stillness that came over him when he was thinking through a problem. "I could go," she offered. "A woman with a baby asking about work or supplies. Nobody thinks twice about that." "Not happening." Jack's response was immediate and firm. "You're still recovering, and besides, if something goes wrong, you need to be free to run," Willa finished. "I understand the logic, Jack, but I'm not helpless." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him wrestling with something. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, as if he was testing unfamiliar ground. "It's not about helpless. It's about—" He stopped, started again. "I lost everything once by trusting the wrong person. I won't lose—" Another pause, and she could see the effort it took for him to continue. "I won't lose you and Hope to my past mistakes." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. It was the closest either of them had come to naming what was growing between them, this careful tenderness that felt too precious to examine too closely. "Then we go together," Willa said simply. "I can ride, and Hope travels easy. We tell anyone who asks that we're headed to my cousin's place, which is true enough." Jack looked as if he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him. "All right, but we're careful. In and out, just gathering information." They spent the next hour preparing for the journey. Jack saddled the mare, while Willa packed what little they had, including the small bundle of belongings that represented Hope's entire wardrobe. Clothes fashioned from Jack's spare shirt and pieces of her own torn petticoat. It was while she was folding these makeshift garments that she found it, a small, leather-bound book tucked among her things. Her mother's recipe collection, water-stained but intact, filled with careful notations in familiar handwriting. She'd forgotten she'd grabbed it in her hurried flight from the Harper house. "What's that?" Jack asked, noticing her stillness. "Recipes. My mother's." She opened it carefully, seeing notes written in the margins, small observations about quantities and cooking times that brought her mother's voice back as clearly as if she were standing there. "I thought I'd lost it." Jack understood without her having to explain. Everyone who'd ever had to leave everything behind understood the value of small connections to what came before. "Good thing to have," he said quietly. "When we get settled. Somewhere permanent. When, not if." The word carried weight, a declaration of faith in their shared future that made her chest tight with emotion she wasn't ready to name. The ride to Millerville was quiet, both of them alert for any sign of Briggs or trouble. Hope slept against Willa's chest, lulled by the mare's steady gait, and the morning mist gradually gave way to pale sunlight that promised a fair day. As they crested a small hill, the town spread out below them. A handful of buildings clustered around a main street, with farms scattered in the surrounding valley. It looked peaceful, the kind of place where people minded their own business, and strangers were judged more by their actions than their past. "Remember," Jack said, as they approached the outskirts, "we're just passing through. Polite, but not memorable." The general store sat at the center of town, its wide porch crowded with barrels and crates of goods. A few men were gathered there, talking in the easy way of people with time on their hands. They looked up with mild curiosity as Jack and Willa approached, but without alarm. "Morning," called one of them, an older man with gentle eyes and hands, marked by a lifetime of honest work. "Fine day for traveling." "That it is," Jack replied, dismounting and helping Willa down with careful courtesy. "Looking for supplies and maybe some information." "Well, you've come to the right place for both," the man said with a smile. "Tom Bradley," he added, extending his hand. "Own the feed store down the way." Jack shook his hand. "Jack Maddox. This is my wife Willa and our daughter Hope." The lie came so naturally that Willa almost believed it herself. She managed a tired smile that wasn't entirely feigned. The ride had taken more out of her than she'd expected. "Pleased to meet you," Bradley said, tipping his hat to Willa. "You folks settling in the area?" "Thinking about it," Willa said, adjusting Hope in her arms. "Heard there might be work for people willing to put their backs into it. Always room for good folk," Bradley agreed. "What kind of work you looking for?" They spent a few minutes in easy conversation, learning about the town and the surrounding area. It was exactly the kind of place Willa had been dreaming of, close-knit but welcoming, with opportunities for people willing to work hard and deal honestly. It was when they'd moved inside the general store that their luck turned. The proprietor, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Patterson, proved to be exactly the right person to ask about Curtis Briggs. "Oh, I know Curtis Briggs," she said, her voice taking on a distinctly sour note. "Comes through every few months, always with some scheme or story. Last time he was here, he tried to sell me goods that I'm pretty sure he'd stolen from the Morrison place over in Cedar Creek." Jack and Willa exchanged glances. "Stolen goods?" Willa asked with just the right amount of concern. "Couldn't prove it, of course," Mrs. Patterson continued, clearly enjoying having an audience for her grievances. "But the Morrison place was robbed about a week before Briggs showed up with their distinctive silver-work bridle. Coincidence? I don't think so." "Did you report it to the sheriff?" Jack asked. Mrs. Patterson snorted. "Our sheriff's got his good points, but he's not much for investigating things that happen outside his jurisdiction. Besides, by the time I put two and two together, Briggs was long gone." They left the store with more supplies than they'd planned to buy, and a wealth of information about Curtis Briggs. As they prepared to leave town, Willa felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of possibility, of doors opening instead of closing. "He's not as smart as he thinks he is," she observed as they rode back toward the barn. "No," Jack agreed. "And he's made enemies. Question is, how do we use that without making ourselves targets?" They were so absorbed in discussing their options that they almost missed the horse tied behind the barn when they returned. Almost, but not quite. Jack's entire body went tense as he recognized the bay gelding that belonged to Curtis Briggs. They were too late. Their enemy had grown tired of waiting and had come looking for his answer. "Stay back," Jack murmured. But Willa was already sliding from the mare's back, her jaw set with determination. "We face this together," she reminded him firmly. That was the deal. As they approached the barn, they could hear Briggs moving around inside, clearly making himself at home. When they pushed through the door, they found him seated on Jack's usual spot, poking through their few possessions with the casual entitlement of a man who'd already decided he owned them. "Ah, there you are," he said without looking up. "Wondered where you'd gotten to. Hope you used the time to think about my offer." Jack moved to put himself between Briggs and Willa, but she stepped up beside him instead, making it clear they were presenting a united front. "We thought about it," Jack said evenly, "and we decided you can go to hell." Briggs's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Now that's disappointing. Really it is. Means we're going to have to do this the hard way." He stood, his hand moving to rest on the gun at his hip. "See, I've been thinking too, about how a man traveling with a woman and baby might have more to hide than just some old cattle-rustling charges. Makes me wonder what other rewards might be posted for information about folks in your situation." The threat was clear, and Willa felt ice form in her stomach. But before either she or Jack could respond, Hope chose that moment to wake with a hungry cry that filled the barn with the sound of pure innocence. Something flickered across Briggs's face then. Uncertainty, maybe, even shame. It was only for a moment, but it was enough to remind them all that whatever else was happening here, there was a baby involved. "Think about it one more night," Briggs said, his voice less confident than before. "I'll be back tomorrow for a final." Answer, he left without another word, and they listened to him ride away in tense silence. But this time, neither Jack nor Willa felt defeated. They'd seen something in Briggs's eyes that gave them hope, the knowledge that even men like him had lines they were reluctant to cross. "He's not as sure of himself as he pretends," Willa observed. "No," Jack agreed. "And tomorrow we're going to find out just how unsure he really is." That evening, as shadows lengthened across their sanctuary, Jack sat by the fire, whittling a piece of soft pine he'd found near the barn. His hands moved with practiced ease, shaping the wood into something small and smooth. Willa watched him work while Hope nursed, struck by the gentleness in those calloused fingers that could create beauty from something so simple. "What are you making?" she asked softly. Jack paused in his carving, almost shy about showing his work. "A rattle. For Hope. Figured she might like something to hold on to as she grows." The gesture hit Willa harder than she'd expected. In the days since Hope's birth, she'd been so focused on survival that she'd barely had time to think about the future, about toys and laughter and all the small joys that should fill a child's life. Here was this man, this near stranger who owed them nothing, thinking ahead to what Hope might need in the weeks and months to come. "She'll love it," Willa said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite name. Jack resumed his whittling, but she could see the pleased flush that colored his weathered cheeks. "My pa used to make things like this. Said every child deserved something made just for them, with love worked into every cut." It was the first time he'd spoken of his father, and Willa treasured the small confidence like a gift. Each piece of his past that Jack shared felt precious, a sign that the walls around his heart were slowly coming down. "He sounds like a good man." He was. Jack's knife moved in careful, measured strokes. "Died when I was 15, kicked in the head by a spooked horse. Ma followed him the next winter. Think she just couldn't figure out how to live without him. The quiet pain in his voice made Willa want to reach out, to offer comfort the way he'd comforted her through Hope's birth. But she sensed that Jack's grief was old and carefully contained, not something to be handled carelessly. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Jack nodded, accepting her sympathy without deflecting it. "Long time ago now, but I still remember the things he taught me. How to work with your hands, how to treat folks with respect, how to stand up for what's right even when it costs you. Is that why you won't run from Briggs?" Jack's hand stilled on the wood, and for a moment she thought she'd pushed too far. Then he looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Partly, but mostly it's because I'm tired of being the kind of man who runs. My whole life since Arkansas, I've been reacting to what other people did to me. Maybe it's time I chose what kind of man I want to be instead of letting circumstances choose for me." The admission hung between them, heavy with meaning. Willa could see the cost of this revelation in the way Jack held himself, as if he'd opened a door he wasn't sure he could close again. "And what kind of man do you want to be?" she asked gently. Jack's eyes moved to Hope, sleeping peacefully in Willa's arms, then back to her face. "The kind who protects what matters, the kind who doesn't run when running would hurt the people he stopped, color rising in his cheeks again. "The people who depend on him." Something shifted in Willa's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She'd spent months believing that Thomas had been her one chance at love, that widowhood meant accepting a future of loneliness and making do. But sitting here in this abandoned barn, watching Jack carve a toy for her baby with tender concentration, she began to wonder if perhaps the heart was more resilient than she'd given it credit for. "Jack," she said softly, then stopped, not sure how to put her feelings into words that wouldn't scare him away. He looked up, and something in her expression made him set aside his carving. "What is it?" Before she could answer, they heard hoofbeats again, multiple riders this time, approaching fast. Jack was on his feet instantly, moving to the door with the fluid alertness she'd come to recognize as his response to danger. But instead of Briggs, they found themselves facing three men in worn but decent clothes, their faces grim with purpose. The leader, a man with graying hair and a sheriff's badge, held up his hand in a gesture of peace. "Evening, folks. I'm Sheriff Walsh from Millerville. Mind if we have a word?" Jack's body remained tense, but he stepped back to allow the men to approach. "What's this about, Sheriff?" "Curtis Briggs," Walsh said simply. "Word reached me that he's been bothering folks in this area. Thought I'd ride out and see if there was anything I could do to help." Willa felt a surge of hope so strong it made her dizzy. Somehow their visit to town had borne fruit faster than they'd dared hope. "Come inside," Jack said after a moment's hesitation, "but know that I'm armed, and I won't hesitate to defend my family." Walsh nodded approvingly. "Wouldn't expect anything less from a man in your position." They gathered around the fire, the three lawmen accepting Jack's offer of coffee with the easy courtesy of men who understood that hospitality was sacred, even in difficult circumstances. Sheriff Walsh studied Jack's face carefully, but without the calculating look they'd seen from Briggs. "Mrs. Patterson at the general store mentioned you folks were asking about Briggs," Walsh began. "Got me thinking about some other complaints. I've been hearing. Seems our Mr. Briggs has been making quite a nuisance of himself throughout the territory." "Complaints?" Willa asked. 3 separate incidents in the past month alone," Walsh confirmed. "Blackmail mostly. Folks with something to hide, finding themselves paying regular tribute to keep Briggs quiet. Problem is, nobody wants to file formal charges, too afraid of what he might reveal if cornered. But you're here," Jack observed carefully. Walsh's expression grew hard. "I'm here because yesterday Briggs made the mistake of threatening the widow Morrison, 90-year-old woman living alone, and he had the gall to suggest she might lose her farm if certain information came to light. That crossed a line for me." One of the other men spoke up, younger, with the earnest look of someone new to law. "Enforcement. We've been tracking Briggs's movements, trying to build a case, but it's like chasing smoke. He never stays in one place long enough for us to pin him down. Until now, Walsh said with satisfaction. Mrs. Patterson mentioned he seemed mighty interested in you folks, betting he'll be back, and when he is, we'll be waiting. Jack exchanged glances with Willa, and she could see him weighing their options. Trust these lawmen or handle Briggs themselves? The choice could determine everything that came after. There's something you should know, Jack said finally. Briggs has a wanted poster with my name on it. Claims I rustled cattle down in Arkansas. The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Willa held her breath, waiting to see how the sheriff would respond to this revelation. Walsh studied Jack for a long moment, then surprised them both by asking, "Did you?" "No, sir. I was framed by my own brother." Jack's voice was steady, but Willa could see the effort it took to maintain that calm. "Lost everything I'd worked for. Been running ever since." "Why should I believe you?" Walsh asked, not unkindly. Jack's jaw worked for a moment. Then he looked directly at the sheriff. "Because I'm telling you instead of running. Because I'm sitting here with my family instead of halfway to Kansas by now. Guilty men don't usually volunteer information about outstanding warrants." Walsh's expression softened slightly. "Fair point. And it explains why Briggs thinks he's got you trapped." He leaned forward, studying Jack's face intently. "What was your brother's name?" "Marcus Maddox." "Why?" "Because Marcus Maddox was arrested last month in Little Rock. Seems his luck finally ran out, and he's been singing like a canary about all his past activities, including framing his brother for cattle rustling he committed himself." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Willa saw him sway slightly, his face going pale as the implications sank in. "The warrant's been withdrawn," Walsh continued gently. "You're a free man, Jack Maddox. Have been for 3 weeks now." For a moment nobody spoke. Then Jack's control finally cracked, and he buried his face in his hands as years of fear and shame finally found release. Willa moved without thinking, sliding closer to offer what comfort she could, while hope stirred against her chest. "It's over," she whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "It's finally over." When Jack looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears and something else, hope, raw and precious as a newborn's cry. "So what happens now?" he asked shakily. "Now?" Walsh smiled for the first time since arriving. "Now we deal with Mr. Briggs, and then you folks get on with building the life you deserve." The sheriff's plan was simple but effective. They would wait for Briggs to return, as he surely would, then confront him not as victims, but as citizens, with the full backing of the law. The wanted poster that had given him such power over Jack was now worthless, and his pattern of blackmail in the territory had finally caught up with him. As the lawman prepared to take position outside the barn, Walsh pulled Jack aside for a private word. "You know," the sheriff said conversationally, "this territory could use more folks like you. People willing to work hard, treat their neighbors right, stand up for what's decent. If you're thinking about settling down somewhere, Millerville would be glad to have you." Jack looked toward Willa, still holding hope by the dying fire, and something settled in his expression. A peace that had been missing since she'd first met him. "I'll think about it," he said. "We'll think about it." That night, as they waited for morning and whatever it would bring, Jack finished carving the little rattle. He tested it gently, smiling at the soft sound it made, then handed it to Willa with the shy pride of a man offering his heart. "For hope," he said simply. But as Willa watched him settle down beside them for what might be their last night in the barn, she knew the gift was for all of them, a symbol of the future they were finally free to choose together. Morning brought Curtis Briggs back to their barn, but this time he wasn't alone in his confidence. As his horse picked its way through the morning mist, Willa could see the change in his posture, the way he sat straighter in the saddle, as if he'd spent the night convincing himself that intimidation was just another tool of trade. He dismounted with theatrical flourish, clearly expecting to find Jack and Willa cowering in anticipation of his demands. Instead, he found Jack sitting calmly by the fire, drinking coffee as if he hadn't a care in the world. "Morning, Briggs," Jack said pleasantly. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Something flickered across Briggs's face, confusion, maybe suspicion. This wasn't the desperate man he'd left yesterday, and the change clearly unsettled him. "I'm not here for social calls," Briggs said, but his voice lacked the smooth confidence of previous encounters. "I'm here for my answer." "Oh, you'll get an answer," Jack replied. He stood slowly, and Willa saw the exact moment when Briggs noticed. The other men emerging from behind the barn, Sheriff Walsh and his deputies, badges glinting in the morning light. The color drained from Briggs's face. "What is this?" "This," said Sheriff Walsh, stepping forward with quiet authority, "is the end of your little operation, Curtis. You're under arrest for blackmail, extortion, and threatening to harm Mrs. Morrison." For a moment, Briggs looked as if he might run. His eyes darted between the lawmen, calculating distances and odds. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, and even a man as ruthless as Curtis Briggs had enough sense to recognize when the game was over. "You can't prove anything," he said, but the words came out weak and desperate. "Actually, we can," Walsh replied, with satisfaction. "See, Mrs. Morrison might be 90, but she's sharp as a tack. Wrote down every word you said to her, including your threats about her farm. That's more than enough for a judge." As Walsh's deputy moved to secure Briggs's hands, the would-be blackmailer's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising to a whine. "That wanted poster is real. He's a cattle rustler, a criminal. I was doing my civic duty." Walsh's expression grew cold. "That warrant was withdrawn 3 weeks ago, Curtis, which makes you either a liar or too incompetent to do proper research. Either way, you're the only criminal here." They watched in silence as Briggs was loaded onto his horse, hands secured, and his earlier arrogance replaced by the defeated slump of a man who'd finally overplayed his hand. As the group prepared to leave, Sheriff Walsh approached Jack and Willa with a serious expression. "You folks will need to come to town to give statements," he said, "but there's no rush. Take time to get yourselves sorted first." "Thank you," Jack said simply, "for everything." Walsh tipped his hat to Willa, his expression gentling as his gaze moved to Hope. "That's a fine daughter you have there. Make sure you give her a good life." "We will," Willa said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. As the lawmen rode away with their prisoner, an extraordinary quiet settled over the barn. For the first time since they'd found each other, Jack and Willa were truly alone. Truly safe and truly free to choose what came next. "It's over," Jack said wonderingly, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Yes," Willa agreed, "it is." They stood together in the morning light, each lost in their own thoughts about what freedom meant after so long spent looking over their shoulders. Finally, Jack moved to where his saddlebags lay against the barn wall, the same bags that had contained his few possessions when they'd first met. "There's something I need to show you," he said quietly. From the bags, he withdrew a small bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, the same letters Willa had glimpsed that first morning. With careful hands, he untied the ribbon and spread the papers on a makeshift table. "From my folks," he explained, "the only things I saved when I had to run." Willa approached carefully, understanding that she was being invited into something precious and private. The letters were old, the paper yellowed with age and handling, but the love in the careful script was as fresh as if it had been written yesterday. One letter, opened and refolded many times, caught her attention. It was in a woman's hand, the writing shaky with age but determined. "That's the last one my ma wrote," Jack said softly. "Before she died, she knew she was going, and she wanted to make sure I understood something important." Willa looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability in his expression. "What did she want you to understand?" Jack picked up the letter with reverent hands. "That loving someone doesn't make you weak. That a man's strength isn't measured by how much he can carry alone, but by how well he can care for the people who matter to him." He looked directly at Willa then, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've been thinking about what she wrote, about what it means to stop running and start building instead." The air between them felt charged with possibility, heavy with words that hadn't been spoken, but hovered just beneath the surface. Hope stirred in Willa's arms, making small, contented sounds that seemed to underscore the peace of this moment. "Jack," Willa began, but he shook his head gently. "Let me say this while I have the courage," he said. "I know it's been less than 2 weeks. I know you're still grieving your husband, still figuring out how to be a mother, but I need you to know that somewhere in these past days, you and Hope became my reason for staying instead of running." Willa's heart hammered against her ribs as she processed his words. She thought of Thomas, of the grief that had driven her from the only home she'd known. But that grief had softened in recent days, transformed from sharp pain to gentle sadness, a treasured memory rather than an open wound. "I love Thomas," she said carefully, "but he's gone, and I'm still here. We're still here." Jack's expression grew hopeful. "Does that mean—" "It means I want to see where this leads," Willa said simply. "You and me and Hope. Together." The smile that spread across Jack's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that when he reached out to touch her cheek, she could feel the calluses on his fingertips. "I don't have much to offer," he said. "No land, no money, no prospects beyond what we can build with our own hands." "You have yourself," Willa replied. "That's more than enough." When he kissed her, it was with the gentleness of a man who understood that precious things should be handled with care. Hope made a small sound between them, and they broke apart laughing, the baby's presence a reminder that their love story included more than just the two of them. "So what now?" Jack asked, his forehead resting against hers. Willa looked around. The barn that had been their sanctuary, then back at the man who had become her anchor. "Now we figure out how to build a life. Sheriff Walsh said Millerville could use folks like us. You want to settle there?" "I want to settle somewhere we can be a family," Willa said. "Somewhere Hope can grow up, knowing she's loved and safe." Jack nodded slowly, his hands still cradling her face. "Then that's what we'll do, though I should probably ask you proper-like to—" Willa's amazement. He actually dropped to one knee there in the hay-strewn barn, looking up at her with an expression that mixed nervousness with determination. "Willa Harper," he said formally, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you let me be a father to Hope and any other children we might be blessed with?" The laughter that bubbled up from Willa's chest was pure joy. "Jack Maddox, are you proposing to me in a barn?" "Well," Jack said with a grin, "it's where we met. Seems appropriate." "In that case," Willa said, reaching down to pull him back to his feet, "yes, yes to all of it." As they held each other in the soft morning light with Hope sleeping peacefully. Between them, Willa felt the last of her fears slip away. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain but no longer frightening. They would face it together, building something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The silver locket that had belonged to her mother lay among her things, still containing the photograph of Thomas that had once seemed like her, only connection to happiness. But now, as she kissed her future husband in the barn where their love had taken root, Willa realized that the past didn't have to define the future. Love could be found again, in the most unlikely places, with the most unexpected people. "We should go to town," Jack said eventually. "Give our statements, look into settling down proper." "Yes," Willa agreed, "but not today. Today, let's just be grateful for what we have." They spent the day in quiet celebration, making plans and sharing dreams, while Hope gurgled contentedly with her new wooden rattle. As evening approached, they sat by their fire one last time as the unlikely couple who had found each other in desperation and chosen each other in hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make and obstacles to overcome. But tonight they were simply Jack and Willa and Hope, a family born in the shelter of an abandoned barn, ready to face whatever came next together. 3 days later, as they prepared to leave for Millerville to give their statements and begin planning their future, Jack made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been clearing debris from the far corner of the barn, thinking to leave the place better than they'd found it, when his hand encountered something unexpected. A metal box, buried beneath years of accumulated hay and dirt. "Willa," he called, excitement coloring his voice. "Come look at this." She approached carefully, hope cradled in her arms, and watched as Jack brushed away the last of the dirt to reveal a small strongbox, its metal surface tarnished but intact. With gentle hands, he lifted it from its hiding place, surprised by its weight. "Someone hid this here deliberately," he observed, examining the simple lock that secured the box. "Question is, what's inside? And who put it there?" The lock was old and corroded, yielding easily to pressure from Jack's knife. As the lid creaked open, they both held their breath, uncertain what they might find. What lay inside made Willa gasp with surprise. Papers, mostly. Documents carefully wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. But underneath the papers was something even more unexpected. A deed bearing official seals and signatures. Jack lifted the document with careful hands, his eyes scanning the formal language with growing amazement. "This is a deed to this property," he said slowly. "The barn, the surrounding 40 acres, water rights to the creek that runs behind the hill." "Who does it belong to?" Willa asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jack read further, then looked up with wonder. "Marcus and Elias Hutchinson, dated 1871. But look at this." He pointed to additional notations in the margins. "Taxes paid through 1878, then nothing. Property appears to have been abandoned." Willa's mind raced through the implications. Abandoned property can be claimed through adverse possession, can't it, if someone lives on it and improves it for a certain period? "In Missouri, I think it's 10 years, Jack said thoughtfully. "But we'd need to check with someone who knows. The law proper." They spent the rest of the morning examining the other papers in the box. Most were receipts and correspondence related to the property, but one letter caught their attention. Written in a shaky hand, it appeared to be from Elias Hutchinson to his brother Marcus, dated just 3 years ago. "I'm dying, Marcus," the letter read. "The consumption's got me, and there's no family left to carry on. The barn and land should go to someone who'll use them right, not sit empty while the county fights over unpaid taxes. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're the last of us. Do what you think best." "So Marcus inherited from his brother," Willa said softly. "But he never came to claim it?" Jack was studying another document, his expression growing. Thoughtful. According to this, Marcus Hutchinson died in the winter of 1877, froze to death in a blizzard, trying to reach town for supplies. The property's been sitting empty ever since. The implications were staggering. They'd been living on land that technically belonged to no one, caring for a property that had been abandoned by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Under Missouri law, their residency and improvements could give them a legitimate claim to ownership. "We need to talk to Sheriff Walsh," Jack said finally, "and probably a lawyer. But if this is real, if we could actually own this place, we could build a real home here," Willa finished, her voice thick with emotion. "For hope, for ourselves. A place that's truly ours." The ride to Millerville that day felt different, charged with possibility neither of them had dared imagine. They carried the deed and supporting documents carefully wrapped in Jack's saddlebags, treating them like the precious treasures they might prove to be. Sheriff Walsh greeted them with genuine warmth, clearly pleased to see them looking more settled and hopeful than when they'd last met. His expression grew serious, though, when they explained their discovery and showed him the documents. "This is beyond my expertise," he admitted after studying the papers carefully. "But there's a lawyer in town, Samuel Morrison, Mrs. Morrison's nephew, who specializes in property law. Honest man, fair prices. If anyone can sort this out, it's him." Samuel Morrison proved to be a thin, thoughtful man in his 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the patient manner of someone accustomed to explaining complex legal matters to worried citizens. He examined their documents with the careful attention they deserved, asking detailed questions about their residency and improvements to the property. "This is quite remarkable," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "You've stumbled onto what appears to be a clear case of abandoned property with documented prior ownership. Under Missouri law, if you can prove continuous residency and improvement for the statutory period, which in cases of abandonment can be as little as 5 years, you have grounds for an adverse possession claim." 5 years, Jack repeated. "We've only been there 2 weeks, Morrison smiled. "Ah, but you're thinking of this the wrong way. You wouldn't be claiming against a living owner, but rather stepping in to resolve an abandonment that's been ongoing for several years. The county's been losing tax revenue, the property's been deteriorating, and no heir has come forward to claim it." He shuffled through the papers again, his expression growing more positive. "With proper documentation of your improvements and intent to remain, along with payment of back taxes and a small filing fee, I believe we could establish clear title within a matter of months rather than years." The hope that bloomed in Willa's chest was almost too intense to bear. "Are you saying we could actually own the land?" "I'm saying there's an excellent chance of it," Morrison confirmed. "The bigger question is whether you're prepared for the responsibility. Property ownership isn't just about having a place to live. It's about taxes, improvements, legal obligations. Are you ready for that?" Jack and Willa exchanged glances, and she could see the same determination in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. "We're ready," Jack said firmly. "We want to build a life there, raise hope properly, maybe help other folks who need a fresh start." Morrison nodded approvingly. "Then let's get the paperwork started. I'll need you to document every improvement you make, keep receipts for any materials or supplies, and maintain continuous residency for at least the next few months while we navigate the legal process." As they left Morrison's office with a stack of legal forms and a timeline for establishing their claim, Willa felt as if she were floating. The abandoned barn that had been their desperate refuge was transforming into something else entirely, a true home, a place where they could put down roots and build the future they'd scarcely dared dream of. "I can't believe it," she said, as they walked down Millerville's main street, hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. "This morning we were just grateful to have shelter, and now we might have a real home." Jack finished, his voice filled with wonder. "Land of our own, a place to raise hope and any other children we might have." They spent the afternoon in town, purchasing supplies and materials for improving the barn and surrounding property. The wooden cross that would mark their doorway was Jack's idea, a simple symbol of faith and gratitude, hand-carved from oak that would weather the seasons as they built their life together. As they prepared to return to what they now dared call their land, Sheriff Walsh approached them with news that cast a shadow over their happiness. "Thought you should know," he said quietly. "Had word from Little Rock about Curtis Briggs. Seems he's got friends who aren't too happy about his arrest. Nothing specific, but there's talk of folks coming to settle accounts." Jack's expression hardened. "What kind of folks?" "The kind who don't much care about law and order," Walsh replied grimly. "Probably nothing will come of it, but I wanted you aware. Might be wise to keep your eyes open for the next few weeks." The warning added a note of tension to their journey. Home, but it couldn't entirely dampen their spirits. As their barn came into view in the evening light, it looked different somehow. Not just a shelter from the storm, but the foundation of something permanent and precious. "Whatever comes," Jack said as they approached their door, "we'll face it together." "Together," Willa agreed, adjusting hope in her arms as they stepped inside their future home. That night, as they sat by their fire planning improvements and dreaming of the life they would build, neither mentioned the shadow that Walsh's warning had cast over their happiness, but both understood that their struggle for peace and security wasn't over yet. The past had a way of reaching forward, and Curtis Briggs might be gone, but the enemies he'd made weren't necessarily finished with the people who'd brought about his downfall. Still, as Jack carved their simple wooden cross and Willa nursed hope by the firelight, their small sanctuary felt like the strongest fortress in the world, Whatever tomorrow brought, they would meet it as a family, on land that was becoming theirs through sweat and hope, and the kind of love that could transform even the humblest shelter into a true home. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a nervous-looking boy from town who clearly wanted nothing more than to deliver his message and ride away as quickly as possible. Jack accepted the envelope with growing unease, noting the expensive paper and the careful script that spelled out his name. "Who's it from?" Willa asked, looking up from where she was tending Hope near the fire. Jack studied the return address, his face going pale. "Marcus Maddox," he said quietly. "My brother." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Marcus was supposed to be in prison in Little Rock, singing about his crimes to anyone who would listen. The last thing any of them had expected was direct correspondence from the man who had destroyed Jack's life. With careful hands, Jack opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. As he read, his expression moved through surprise, confusion, and finally settled into something that looked like grim acceptance. "What does he say?" Willa prompted gently. Jack looked up, his eyes holding a mixture of pain and resignation. "He's not in prison anymore. Claims there was a mistrial, some problem with evidence handling. He's been released and he's coming." "Here?" "Here?" Willa's voice rose with alarm. "How does he know where we are?" Jack continued reading, his jaw tightening with each line. "Says he heard about Briggs being arrested for blackmail involving me. Says he's been tracking my movements for months, trying to make things right between us." He looked up with bitter laughter. "Apparently he wants to apologize in person for framing me." "That's," Willa began, then stopped as the full implications hit her. "Jack, if he's been tracking you, then he knows about me and Hope. He knows about this place." "Gets worse," Jack said grimly, returning to the letter. "He's not coming alone. Says he's bringing his business associates to help him settle old debts and start fresh." Jack's voice grew heavy with foreboding. "Knowing Marcus, that means trouble of the worst kind." Willa felt ice form in her stomach. They'd fought so hard for this fragile peace, this chance at happiness. The legal claim to their land was progressing smoothly. Their small improvements were transforming the barn into a real home, and Hope was thriving in their care. Now Marcus threatened to tear it all apart. "When?" she asked simply. 3 days, Jack replied. "Maybe 4, depending on weather." They stared at each other across the small space that had become their sanctuary, both understanding that everything was about to change again. But this time they weren't alone and desperate. This time they had something worth fighting for. "We need to get word to Sheriff Walsh," Willa said practically, "and we need to understand exactly what Marcus wants." Jack was already moving, gathering his coat and hat. "I'll ride to town, talk to Walsh and Morrison. You and Hope should come with me. I don't want you here alone if Marcus decides to arrive early." "No," Willa said firmly. "If we run now, we lose any claim to this place. Besides, Hope's too young for that much travel, and I won't raise her to believe that running is the answer to every problem." Jack paused, studying her face. "Willa, you don't understand what Marcus is capable of. He destroyed my life once already, and—" "Now you're not the same man he destroyed," Willa interrupted. "You have people who believe in you, a home to defend, a family to protect. That changes things." Something shifted in Jack's expression, a hardening that spoke of resolve rather than fear. "You're right. I've been running from Marcus for years, but maybe it's time he faced what his betrayal cost both of us." They spent the rest of the morning planning. Jack would go to town for reinforcements and legal advice, while Willa would stay to guard there, claim and continue the improvements that strengthened their legal position. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was better than panic. Jack was saddling the mare when Willa found it. Another letter. This one tucked under a loose board near the barn's entrance. Her blood chilled as she recognized the same expensive paper, the same careful script. "Jack," she called, her voice tight with strain. "There's another one." This letter was addressed to her, and the contents made her hands shake as she read. Marcus hadn't just been tracking Jack. He'd been investigating all of them. He knew about her flight from the Harper family, about her deceased husband, about the legal proceedings she'd been avoiding. "What is it?" Jack asked, returning quickly. To her side. "He knows about the Harpers," Willa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About their claim on Hope. He says—" She had to stop, steadying herself before continuing. "He says he's been in contact with them, that they've hired him to bring Hope back to them." The letter slipped from her nerveless fingers as the full horror of the situation became clear. Marcus wasn't just coming to torment Jack, he was coming to destroy their entire family. The Harpers' claim on Hope might not be legal, but in the hands of a man like Marcus, legality mattered less than leverage. Jack retrieved the letter, reading quickly. His face grew darker with each line. "Son of a—" He caught himself, glancing at Hope. "He's working with them. The Harpers hired him to track you down and bring Hope back. In exchange, they're not pursuing any legal action against him for his past crimes." "They can't take her," Willa said fiercely. "She's my daughter. They can try," Jack said grimly. "And with Marcus helping them, they might succeed. He's got a talent for making truth look like lies, and lies look like truth." But as Jack spoke, Willa felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not fear, but fury. She'd spent months running from the Harpers, terrified of their wealth and connections, but she wasn't the same desperate, grieving woman who'd fled in the night. She was a mother defending her child, a woman who'd found love again, a person with a community and legal standing. "Let them come," she said with quiet intensity. "Let Marcus and the Harpers come together if they want. This is our land now, our home. Hope is our daughter, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take her away." Jack stared at her, seeing perhaps for the first time the steel that ran beneath her gentle nature. "You're serious, dead serious. We've got law on our side now, witnesses to our character, proof of our ability to provide for Hope. More than that, we've got each other." She moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "You said yourself you were tired of running. Well, so am I." That afternoon, they rode to town together, Hope secure in Willa's arms as they carried their grim news to Sheriff Walsh. His reaction was everything they'd hoped for. Immediate concern, followed by decisive action. "Marcus Maddox working with the Harpers," Walsh mused, leaning back in his chair. "That's a combination that could cause real trouble. But it's also a mistake on their part." "How so?" Jack asked. "Because now it's not just about old cattle rustling, charges or family disputes. Now it's about kidnapping and extortion involving a baby. That brings federal law into play, and federal marshals don't much care about local politics or family money." Walsh stood, moving to his desk with purpose. "I'm sending word to the district marshal today. Meanwhile, you folks need to document everything, every threat, every contact, every attempt to intimidate or coerce. Build a record that shows exactly what kind of people we're dealing with." As they prepared to leave, Walsh called Jack aside for a private word. "There's something else you should know," the sheriff said quietly. "That faded letter in your saddlebags, the one from your mother. I've been thinking about what it says, about strength coming from protecting what matters." Jack looked puzzled. "What about it?" "Sometimes a man's past catches up with him, not as punishment, but as a chance to finally set things right. Maybe Marcus coming here isn't the disaster you think it is. Maybe it's your chance to stop running and start fighting back." As they rode home in the gathering dusk, Jack was unusually quiet. Finally, as their barn came into view, he spoke. "Walsh is right about one thing. Running hasn't solved anything. All these years, I've been letting Marcus define who I am. The man who lost everything, the man who couldn't protect what mattered. Maybe it's time I showed him who I really am." "And who is that?" Willa asked softly. Jack looked at her and Hope, his expression fierce with protective love. "A man who's finally found something worth fighting for." That night, as they made their preparations for the confrontation that was coming, neither spoke of the fear that lurked beneath their determination. But both understood that their peaceful sanctuary was about to become a battleground, and everything they'd built together would be tested by the worst that their pasts could bring against them. The wooden cross Jack had carved for their doorway gleamed in the firelight, a simple symbol of faith and hope. Tomorrow they would discover whether love and determination could triumph over greed and betrayal, whether the family they'd created in this unlikely place could withstand the storm that was coming to tear them apart. Dawn on the third day brought more than just morning light. It brought riders on the horizon, moving with the deliberate pace of people who knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do when they arrived. Jack spotted them, first from his position in the barn's loft, where he'd been keeping watch since before sunrise. 4 riders, he called down quietly to Willa. Marcus is in the lead, and there's a woman with them. Probably Margaret Harper. Willa's hands tightened. Around the shotgun they'd retrieved from its hiding place among the rafters. The weapon was old but well-maintained, and Jack had spent the previous evening teaching her how to use it properly. She prayed she wouldn't need to, but the weight of it in her hands was oddly comforting. "Hope?" Jack asked. Sleeping in the back, her corner wrapped warm and safe. Willa's voice was steady, but Jack could hear the steel beneath the calm. She'd spent the last 3 days transforming from worried mother to fierce protector, and the change was remarkable to witness. The riders approached slowly, giving Jack time to study them through the gaps in the barn's walls. Marcus looked older. Then Jack remembered, his face bearing the marks of hard living and harder choices. The woman beside him sat her horse with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of will. Margaret Harper. No doubt, the other 2 men were clearly hired muscle, the kind of men who solved problems with violence when words failed. Jack felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the type. Marcus had always preferred to let others handle his dirty work. "Jack Maddox," Marcus called out when they were still 50 yards away. "I know you're in there. Come out and let's talk like civilized men." "Stay where you are," Jack called back. "You can say whatever you came to say from there." Marcus chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Still the stubborn fool, I see. Some things never change." He urged his horse closer, stopping just outside what he probably calculated was rifle range. "I've got someone here who wants to meet your companion." Margaret Harper urged her horse forward, her expensive riding habit a stark contrast to the rough country around them. When she spoke, her voice carried the imperious tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Mrs. Harper," she called, deliberately using Willa's former name. "I am Margaret Harper, Thomas's mother. I've come to collect my grandchild and discuss your situation." "My name is Willa Maddox now," Willa called back firmly, "and my daughter is staying right where she belongs, with her family." The claim of marriage was a small lie that carried large implications. Jack felt a surge of pride at her quick thinking, even as he noted the way Margaret Harper's face darkened with rage. "That child carries the Harper name and Harper blood," Margaret Harper shouted. "She belongs with her rightful family, not with some drifter you've taken up with." "The child belongs with her mother," a new voice called from behind them. Jack's heart leaped as he recognized Sheriff Walsh's voice. The lawman rode into view with 3 deputies, their badges glinting in the morning sun. But Jack's relief faded as he saw that they were outnumbered, and Marcus's hired men had the look of professionals who wouldn't be easily intimidated by local law enforcement. "Sheriff Walsh," Marcus said with mock courtesy, "how good of you to join us. Though I'm not sure this is a matter for local law enforcement. Any matter involving threats against citizens of my county is my business," Walsh replied evenly. "I suggest you state your business and move along." Margaret Harper spurred her horse forward, clearly believing that her social position gave her authority even here. "These people are harboring a child that legally belongs to my family. We have documents that have no legal standing in Missouri." Another voice interrupted. This time it was Samuel Morrison, the lawyer, riding up with a leather satchel that undoubtedly contained the legal ammunition they'd need for this fight. Jack felt a surge of gratitude for the man's presence. "Mrs. Harper," Morrison continued professionally, "your late son's child is in the custody of her natural mother, who has remarried and established legal residency in this county. Unless you have a court order from a Missouri judge granting you custody, you have no legal claim here." "Remarried?" Marcus's voice carried a note of surprise that quickly turned to suspicion. "Jack, you work fast for a man who was running for his life 2 weeks ago." "Things change, Marcus," Jack called back. "People change. Some of us learn from our mistakes instead of repeating them." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut, with both sides maneuvering for advantage while trying to avoid the violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. But it was Margaret Harper who finally pushed the situation past the point of negotiation. "I didn't come all this way to be lectured by country lawyers and backwoods sheriffs," she declared imperiously. "That child is coming with me, one way or another." She gestured to Marcus, who in turn nodded to his hired men. The movement was subtle, but Jack had been watching for it. The time for talking was over. "Willa, get down!" Jack called as he brought his rifle to bear on the nearest gunman. The next few moments exploded into chaos. The hired men went for their weapons just as Sheriff Walsh and his deputies moved to intercede. Jack's rifle cracked, once, then twice, and one of the gunmen tumbled from his saddle while the other dove for cover behind his horse. Margaret Harper's horse reared in terror, nearly throwing her to the ground, while Marcus fought to control his own mount and draw, his weapon at the same time. In the confusion, nobody noticed the small figure that had appeared at the barn's entrance. "Stop!" Willa's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She stood in the doorway, hope in one arm and the shotgun in the other, her face pale but determined. "Everybody just stop." The authority in her voice was so unexpected that even the combatants paused, weapons half drawn, to stare at her. "Mrs. Harper," Willa continued, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "you want to see your grandchild? Fine. Here she is." She stepped forward carefully, making sure everyone could see Hope's small face peeking out from her blankets. The baby was awake but calm, her dark eyes taking in the strange scene with the solemn curiosity of the very young. "Look at her," Willa said simply. "Really look at her. Does she look neglected, unloved? Does she look like a child who needs rescuing?" Even from a distance, it was clear that Hope was thriving. Her cheeks were round and healthy, her eyes bright and alert. She was clean and warm and obviously well cared for, the picture of a contented baby. "She's beautiful," Margaret Harper said quietly, and for the first time her voice held genuine emotion instead of cold calculation. "Yes, she is," Willa agreed, "and she's loved. Not just by me, but by the man who helped bring her into this world, who's been a father to her since her first breath. She has a family, Mrs. Harper, a real family." Margaret Harper stared at the baby for a long moment, and Jack could see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Whatever her faults, she clearly felt genuine love for Hope, even if she'd been expressing it in destructive ways. "I just want what's best for her," Margaret Harper said finally, her voice smaller than before. "Then let her stay where she belongs," Willa said gently. "You can visit if you want. You can be part of her life. But she's not a possession to be claimed. She's a child who needs love and stability." For a moment, it seemed as if reason might prevail. Margaret Harper looked genuinely torn, perhaps seeing for the first time that her grandchild was truly loved and cared for. But Marcus had no intention of letting sentiment interfere with whatever deal he'd made with the Harpers. "Touching speech," he said with deliberate cruelty. "But it doesn't change the facts. My brother's a wanted fugitive shacked up with a woman who's probably not even legally widowed. That's no environment for raising a Harper heir." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Jack felt rage boil up in his chest, all the old pain and humiliation that Marcus had caused flooding back. But before he could respond, Willa's voice cut through his anger like a lifeline. "You're wrong," she said simply, "about all of it." She looked directly at Marcus, her expression calm and certain. "Jack isn't a fugitive. The charges against him were dropped when you were arrested for the same crimes. I am legally widowed, with documentation to prove it, and this child couldn't ask for a better father than the man who chose to love her when he didn't have to. Marcus's face went through several expressions as he processed this information. Clearly, his release from prison hadn't included a full briefing on how thoroughly his past lies had been exposed. That's not possible," he stammered. "It's not only possible, it's documented," Morrison said crisply, pulling papers from his satchel. "Would you like to see the federal marshal's report on your case, or perhaps the statement from the Arkansas authorities clearing your brother of all charges?" The hired gunmen were looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized their employer had lied to them about the nature of their mission. Sheriff Walsh, reading the situation correctly, began moving closer with his deputies. "I think it's time." "You folks moved along," Walsh said firmly, "before this situation gets any more complicated than it already is." But Marcus wasn't finished. Years of resentment and jealousy boiled over as he realized that his brother had not only survived his betrayal, but had actually built a better life than Marcus himself had ever managed. "You always did think you were." "Better than me," Marcus snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "Perfect Jack, with his perfect morals and his perfect little life. Well, let's see how perfect you are when—" He never finished the sentence. Sheriff Walsh's deputy was faster, and Marcus's weapon had barely cleared leather before he found himself staring down the barrel of a Colt .45. "I wouldn't," the deputy said conversationally. The remaining hired gunman, seeing his partner down, and his employer disarmed, slowly raised his hands in surrender. The fight went out of the situation as quickly as it had built up, leaving everyone standing in the morning sun wondering how close they'd come to genuine tragedy. Margaret Harper looked around at the aftermath of her grandchild's near kidnapping, her face pale with shock. "This isn't— I never wanted—" "I know," Willa said gently. "You love her, but love means wanting what's best for her, not what's easiest for you." As Sheriff Walsh and his men secured Marcus and his remaining accomplice, Margaret Harper rode slowly toward the barn. Up close, she could see Hope even more clearly, the bright eyes, the contented expression, the obvious signs of good care and deep love. "May I?" she began hesitantly. Willa stepped forward, close enough that Margaret could truly see her granddaughter. "Would you like to hold her?" For the first time since her arrival, Margaret Harper looked uncertain, almost vulnerable. "Yes, if you don't mind." As Willa carefully transferred Hope to her grandmother's arms, Jack saw the exact moment when Margaret Harper's heart broke open. The baby looked up at this new face with interest, making small sounds that could have been interpreted as happiness. "She's perfect," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Absolutely perfect." "Yes, she is," Willa agreed, "and she always will be, as long as she's surrounded by people who truly love her." When Margaret Harper finally looked up from Hope's face, her expression had changed completely. The imperious anger was gone, replaced by something much more real and vulnerable. "I've been a fool," she said quietly. "Thomas would be ashamed of what I've done." "Thomas would want his daughter to be happy and loved," Willa said simply. "That's all any of us want." As the sun climbed higher in the Missouri sky, the confrontation that had threatened to destroy their fragile happiness transformed into something else entirely, a moment of understanding between women who both loved the same child and the beginning of a future none of them had imagined when the day began. The moment of peace couldn't last. Even as Margaret Harper cradled Hope with newfound tenderness, Marcus's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, bitter with the poison of old resentments. "Don't let her fool you," he called from where Sheriff Walsh's deputy held him at gunpoint. "My dear brother's got you all believing his lies just like he always did. Saint Jack, who could do no wrong." Jack felt the familiar knot of anger tightening in his chest, the same rage that had driven him to flee Arkansas all those years ago. But this time something was different. This time he had Willa beside him, Hope depending on him, and a community that had seen his character firsthand. "Let it go, Marcus. Jack said wearily. It's over. Over? Marcus laughed, the sound harsh and desperate. It's never over between us, brother, not until one of us is dead. Margaret Harper looked up sharply from Hope, clearly disturbed by the venom in Marcus's voice. Mr. Maddox, I think perhaps— You think perhaps what? Marcus snarled. That. You can trust him? Ask him about the money, Mrs. Harper. Ask him about the $1,000 that went missing from our father's estate. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Jack felt the blood drain from his face as memories he'd tried to bury came flooding back. The money had gone missing after their father's funeral, and Marcus had convinced everyone, including Jack himself, in his grief-stricken state, that Jack must have taken it to fund his ranch venture. That's a lie, Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction. For years he'd wondered if Marcus might have been right, if grief and desperation had driven him to theft he couldn't remember. Is it? Marcus's smile was triumphant and cruel. Tell. Hid them how you left town the very next day, with enough money to buy land and cattle. Tell them how you never could explain where that money came from. Willa stepped closer to Jack, her presence an anchor in the storm of confusion and shame that Marcus's words had unleashed. Jack didn't steal anything, she said firmly. How would you know? Marcus shot back. You've known him for 2 weeks. I've known him his whole life. Sheriff Walsh looked between the brothers, his expression troubled. The missing money was a serious accusation, one that could undermine everything they'd built in the community's eyes. But it was Margaret Harper who spoke next, her voice cutting through the tension with unexpected authority. Where is this money? Now, she asked Marcus directly. Marcus blinked, clearly not expecting the question. What do you mean? The $1,000 you claim Jack stole. Where is it now? If he took it 7 years ago to start his ranch, and his ranch was lost when he was framed for cattle rustling, what happened to the money? It was invested in the ranch. Lost when you framed him, Margaret Harper finished coldly. How convenient for you. Something flickered in Marcus's eyes, a moment of uncertainty that suggested Margaret Harper had hit closer to the truth than he'd expected. But before he could respond, another voice entered the conversation. Tom Bradley, the feed store owner from Millerville, had ridden up during the confrontation and had been listening with growing interest. Excuse me, Bradley said politely, but did someone mention a missing $1,000 from the Maddox estate? Marcus went very still. What's it to you, old man? Bradley smiled pleasantly, but his eyes were sharp. Oh, nothing much, except I was wondering if you'd finally spent it all, or if there's some left. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye turned to Bradley, who seemed to be enjoying the attention. You see, Bradley continued conversationally, I was in Arkansas about 5 years back visiting my sister. Happened to be in a saloon in Little Rock when a man matching your description came in, drunk as a lord, and bragging about how he'd outsmarted his saint of a brother by taking their inheritance and framing him for rustling. Marcus's face had gone white. That's a lie. Maybe it is, Bradley agreed cheerfully, but the man showed everyone a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, claimed he'd sold everything else from the estate and used the money to buy cattle that he then rustled and blamed on his brother. Said it was the perfect revenge for years of being treated like the family disappointment. From his pocket, Bradley produced a small, worn item that made Jack's breath catch. It was their father's pocket watch. The one Marcus had claimed was lost in the chaos after the funeral. Funny thing is, Bradley continued, the drunk man dropped this when he passed out. Bartender was going to keep it, but I convinced him to sell it to me instead. Been looking for the rightful owner ever since. He tossed the watch to Jack, who caught it with trembling hands. The familiar weight of it, the worn engraving of his father's initials, brought back a flood of memories. His father, checking the time before dinner, winding it carefully each night before bed, promising that someday it would belong to Jack as the eldest son. That's not proof of anything, Marcus said desperately, but his voice had lost all conviction. Maybe not, Sheriff Walsh said, his voice hard with disgust, but it's enough to make me real interested in investigating your other claims. starting with how a man supposedly broke and running from cattle-rustling charges managed to hire 2 professional gunmen and travel all the way from Arkansas to Missouri. The web of lies was unraveling faster than Marcus could weave new ones. His hired guns, realizing they'd been lied to about the nature of their mission, were edging away from their employer with expressions of professional disgust. But Marcus wasn't finished. Cornered animals were always most dangerous, and as his carefully constructed narrative collapsed around him, his desperation transformed into something much more volatile. "Fine," he snarled, his hand inching toward the gun at his hip, despite the deputy's watchful presence. "Fine. I took the money. I framed you. I did everything you think I did, and you know what? I'd do it again." The admission hit Jack like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because hearing it spoken aloud finally laid to rest years of self-doubt and guilt. "Why?" Jack asked quietly. "Why destroy your own brother?" Marcus's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Because you had everything. Father's love, mother's pride, everyone's respect. Perfect Jack, who could do no wrong while I couldn't do anything right. I wanted to see you lose it all, just once. I wanted to watch you have nothing, the way I always had nothing." "You had everything I had," Jack said sadly. "You chose to throw it away. I chose to take what should have been mine." Marcus screamed, finally lunging for his weapon. But years of rage and jealousy had made him careless. The deputy's gun was already drawn, and Marcus's shot went wide as he tumbled from his horse. He hit the ground hard, his weapon spinning away into the dirt, and for a moment everyone thought the confrontation was finally over. Then Margaret Harper screamed. In the chaos of Marcus's desperate attack, no one had noticed his remaining hired gun moving into position. The man had hope in his arms, and a pistol pressed against her tiny head, his face grim with professional determination. "Nobody move," the gunman said calmly. "I don't like hurting babies, but I will if I have to. Now Mrs. Harper is going to take this child and ride away, and the rest of you are going to let her." The tableau that followed was frozen in time. Jack and Willa motionless with terror, Sheriff Walsh and his deputies unable to act without risking Hope's life, Margaret Harper staring in horror at what her desire for her grandchild had unleashed. But it was Margaret Harper herself who broke the deadlock. "No," she said simply, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Put her down." The gunman looked confused. "Ma'am, this is what you wanted." "This is not what I wanted," Margaret Harper said, moving toward him with the fearless determination of a woman who'd made her choice. "I wanted my grandchild safe and loved. She is safe and loved, right here, with her real family." She reached out with steady hands. "Give her to me." For a moment, the gunman hesitated, clearly uncertain how to handle a client who'd changed her mind at the crucial moment. That moment of hesitation was all Jack needed. He moved with fluid precision, years of hard living having honed his reflexes to razor sharpness. The gunman's attention was split between Margaret Harper and maintaining his hold on Hope. And in that split second of divided focus, Jack struck. The fight was brief, but vicious. Jack's priority was getting Hope away from danger, and he succeeded in that goal even as the gunman's elbow caught him across the temple. Margaret Harper caught the baby as Jack and the hired gun went down in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence. When Sheriff Walsh and his deputies finally separated them, the gunman was unconscious and Jack was bleeding from a gash above his eye, but Hope was safe in her grandmother's arms, crying but unharmed. "It's over," Willa breathed, moving to take her daughter from Margaret Harper's trembling hands. "Yes," Margaret Harper agreed, her voice thick with tears and regret. "It's finally over." As Marcus was loaded into the sheriff's wagon alongside his accomplices, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the absence of fear. The brother who'd haunted his dreams and shaped his choices was finally just a man, defeated by his own hatred and greed. The christening gown that Willa had sewn for Hope from scraps of fabric seemed to glow in the morning light as she held their daughter clothes. It was a symbol of all the hopes and dreams they'd stitched together in this unlikely place. Fragile but beautiful, born of love and determination. "What happens now?" Jack asked Margaret Harper as they prepared to part ways. The older woman looked at Hope one last time, her expression soft with love and loss. "Now I go home and remember that my son would want his daughter to be happy, and perhaps I write letters instead of hiring kidnappers." It was an offer of peace, tentative but genuine. Willa nodded slowly, understanding passing between the two women who both loved the same child. "Letters would be welcome," Willa said gently. "Hope should know about her father, about the family that loved him." As the various parties prepared to leave, the sheriff with his prisoners, Margaret Harper with her regrets, the community members with their relief, Jack found himself standing beside Willa in front of their barn, holding Hope and marveling at how much their world had changed in a single morning. The crisis was over, but the real work of building their life together was just beginning. As Sheriff Walsh's wagon disappeared down the dusty road with Marcus and his accomplices secured, in the back, an unexpected quiet settled over the barn and surrounding land. The morning's confrontation had ended, but Jack felt a strange emptiness where years of anger and fear had once lived. He stood holding Hope, while Willa tended to the cut above his eye, both of them processing what had just transpired. "It's really over?" Willa said softly, dabbing at his wound with gentle hands. "Marcus can't hurt us anymore." Jack nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the retreating wagon. "I keep expecting to feel, I don't know, triumphant maybe? Vindicated? And instead I just feel sad for what we might have been as brothers, if he'd chosen differently." Jack's voice carried the weight of years of lost hope. "Growing up, I always thought someday we'd work things out. That family meant something." Margaret Harper, who had been preparing to leave, paused at his words. She'd been listening to the exchange with the careful attention of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew. "Family does mean something," she said quietly, "but not the way I thought it did." She approached them slowly, as if unsure of her welcome. In her hands, she carried a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of coins. "This belongs to you," she said, offering the pouch to Jack. "Payment for services I should never have requested. Money that should go toward building something good instead of tearing something apart." Jack looked at the pouch, but made no move to take it. "Mrs. Harper, I can't—" "You can and you will," she said firmly, but not unkindly. "Consider it my grandson-in-law's inheritance. Thomas would have wanted his daughter's stepfather to have the means to provide for her properly." The words hung in the air, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. By calling Jack her grandson-in-law, Margaret Harper was acknowledging not just his relationship with Hope, but his legitimacy as part of the family. It was an acceptance neither of them had expected. "Besides," she continued with a slight smile, "I suspect you'll have expenses. Building a proper home, perhaps a wedding that befits the occasion." Willa's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't contradict the implication. They had spoken of marriage in the abstract, but the reality of it, the planning, the ceremony, the public declaration, had seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford while fighting for survival. "A wedding," Jack repeated, as if testing the word. "A real one," Margaret Harper said gently, "with a proper dress for the bride, flowers, maybe even a small celebration. Hope deserves to see her parents married with joy, not desperation." Before either Jack or Willa could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. But this time, the riders brought news of celebration rather than conflict. Tom Bradley rode up with Samuel Morrison and Dr. William Patterson, the town doctor and husband of the sharp-eyed store proprietor who'd first warned them about Curtis Briggs. Behind them came several other familiar faces from Millerville, all wearing expressions of curiosity and concern. "Heard there. Was trouble out here?" Dr. Patterson called as he dismounted. "Thought you might need medical attention." "Just scratches," Jack replied, but he submitted to the doctor's examination with good grace. As Patterson cleaned and bandaged the cut on his forehead, the other men gathered around with the easy familiarity of neighbors checking on neighbors. "Sheriff Walsh stopped by town on his way to the county seat," Morrison explained. "Filled us in on what happened here. Wanted to make sure you folks were all right and to bring some news." He pulled a folded document from his coat with obvious satisfaction. "Your property claim has been approved. As of this morning, you are the legal owners of 40 acres of prime Missouri farmland, free and clear." The words hit Jack like a physical force. After years of having nothing, of owning nothing, the idea of actually possessing land seemed almost too large to comprehend. "Ours," Willa breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "Really ours, really yours," Morrison confirmed. "Deeds. Being prepared as we speak, should be ready for signature by week's end." Tom Bradley stepped forward with a grin. "Which brings us to the other reason we rode out here. Can't have new landowners in the community without a proper welcome." From his saddlebags, he produced a bottle of what looked like decent whiskey, while Dr. Patterson revealed a basket that smelled deliciously of fresh bread and ham. Other men brought out their own contributions: tools, building supplies, even a small bag of coffee that represented real luxury. "Neighbors help neighbors," Bradley said simply. "That's how things work around here." Margaret Harper watched this display of community support with obvious amazement. In her world of wealth and social position, relationships were often transactional, based on what people could do for each other rather than simple human decency. "This is remarkable," she said quietly to Willa. "You've found something here that money can't buy." "Yes," Willa agreed, watching Jack accept congratulations and offers of help with the shy gratitude of a man still learning to trust in good fortune. "We have." As the impromptu celebration continued, Margaret Harper made her decision. She approached Jack with purpose, her manner formal but not unfriendly. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "I owe you an apology, a real one, not the hollow words I might have offered before." Jack set down his cup of whiskey and gave her his full attention. "Mrs. Harper, please let me finish." She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a difficult confession. "I came here believing that love could be measured in material things, that my granddaughter needed wealth and social position more than she needed genuine affection. Watching you fight for her today, seeing how this community rallied to protect your family, I realize how wrong I was." She looked toward Hope, sleeping peacefully in Willa's arms despite the morning's chaos. "Thomas loved simply and deeply. I see now that his daughter will be raised the same way, and that's exactly what he would have wanted." Jack studied her, in face, seeing genuine remorse where before he'd seen only imperious determination. "What are you saying, Mrs. Harper?" "I'm saying that I would like to be part of Hope's life, if you'll allow it. Not as someone trying to control or claim her, but as a grandmother who loves her from a distance and respects the family that's raising her." The offer was more than Jack had dared hope for. After a morning of confrontation and violence, the possibility of peace with Hope's biological family seemed almost too good to be true. "Letters," Willa said suddenly. "You mentioned letters before." "That might be a good way to start." Margaret Harper nodded eagerly. "Yes, letters and perhaps occasional visits. I could tell her about her father when she's old enough to understand, share memories, photographs." She paused, then reached into her reticule and withdrew a small silver item that caught the light. Jack's father's pocket watch gleamed in her palm, not the one Tom Bradley had returned, but another one, clearly a match to the first. "This belonged to Thomas," she said softly. "His father's watch, just like yours, belonged to your father. I thought perhaps someday when Hope is grown she might like to have it. A connection to both sides of her heritage." The gesture was small but profound, a bridge between past and future that acknowledged Hope's complex family history while respecting her current circumstances. "Thank you," Jack said simply, accepting the watch. "She'll treasure it." As the afternoon wore on and the impromptu celebration continued, Jack found himself standing with Margaret Harper at the edge of the gathering, both of them watching Willa. laugh with the other women, while hope was passed from hand to hand among the men who were already claiming her as their own. "You know," Margaret Harper said thoughtfully, "Thomas would have liked you. You have the same kind of quiet strength he had, the same way of putting others before yourself." "I never got to meet him," Jack replied, "but I'm grateful for the family he left behind, for Willa, for hope, for the chance to be part of something good." Margaret Harper was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Are you happy? Really, truly happy?" Jack looked at Willa, at Hope, at the community of people who'd welcomed them without question or judgment. He thought of the land that was now legally theirs, of the future they could build together, of the love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." As the sun began to set over their newly legal homestead, casting long shadows across the land they could finally call their own, Jack felt the last of his old fears slip away. Marcus was gone, the legal battles were won, and the family he'd never dared dream of was secure. The wooden cross above their door caught the last light of day, a simple symbol of faith and hope that had carried them through their darkest moments. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build and grow and love. But tonight, surrounded by friends and blessed with peace, Jack Maddox was exactly where he belonged. In the distance, Margaret Harper's carriage rolled toward town, carrying a woman transformed by understanding the difference between loving and possessing. Behind her, she left a family stronger for having been tested, a community united by shared values, and a future bright with possibility. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them had instead revealed the strength of what they'd built together. Love, it turned out, was indeed strong enough to overcome the worst that the past could throw against it. 6 months later, the abandoned barn had transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to the desperate souls who'd first sought shelter within its walls. Jack stood in the doorway of what was now unmistakably a home, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across floors he'd planned smooth with his own hands, walls he'd chinked tight against the Missouri winters, and windows he'd installed to let in light and hope in equal measure. The wooden cross still hung above the entrance, weathered now but sturdy, bearing witness to all the changes that had swept through their lives like spring rain after drought. Below it, painted in Willa's careful script, were the words, "The Maddox Family, Esther 1879, marking the place where two broken people had found wholeness in each other. "Coffee's ready," Willa called from the kitchen area, where she stood over the new iron stove that had been their first major purchase as legal landowners. Hope sat in the high chair Jack had crafted during the long winter evenings, babbling contentedly as she gnawed on a piece of bread crust, her dark hair catching the light like her mother's. Jack crossed to them, marveling as he did every morning at the simple miracle of belonging somewhere, of being needed and wanted and loved. He kissed Willa's cheek and ruffled Hope's hair, earning a delighted squeal from the baby who'd grown sturdy and bright in their care. "Letter came yesterday," Willa said, indicating an envelope propped against the sugar bowl. "From Margaret," Jack raised an eyebrow. The correspondence with Hope's grandmother had settled into a comfortable monthly rhythm, Margaret sharing memories of Thomas and updates from her world, while Willa responded with stories of Hope's development and photographs taken by the traveling photographer who'd made Millerville a regular stop. "What does she say this time?" Willa smiled as she poured his coffee. "She's coming for the harvest festival, wants to meet the baby properly, now that things have settled." It had taken months for Margaret Harper to truly accept that her grandchild was better off with Jack and Willa than she would have been in the Harper mansion. But acceptance had come, gradual and genuine, built on letters full of love rather than demands, and photographs that showed Hope thriving in ways that money couldn't buy. "Think you're ready for that?" Jack asked, settling at the table they'd built from oak that grew on their own land. "I think I am," Willa replied, and he could hear the confidence in her voice that had been hard-won over these months of building their life together. She's Hope's grandmother, She deserves to know her granddaughter, and Hope deserves to know where she came from. Through the window, Jack could see the garden Willa had planted in the spring, now heavy with the fruits of her labor. Tomatoes hung red and ripe on the vine. Corn stood tall and golden, and pumpkins sprawled across the ground like orange promises of autumn plenty. It was a garden that fed both body and soul, proof that life could flourish even in the most unlikely places. "Tom Bradley's coming by this afternoon," Jack mentioned, scanning the letter from Margaret. "Wants to talk about that piece of land adjoining ours. Says the owner might be willing to sell." Willa looked up from where she was spooning porridge into Hope's eager mouth. "Do we need more land?" Jack considered the question seriously. They'd proven they could make a good living on their 40 acres, raising crops and a few head of cattle, taking on carpentry work in town when needed. But success had bred ambition, and Jack found himself dreaming of something larger. Need? No. But if we're thinking about the future, about other children maybe, about being able to help folks the way people helped us. He trailed off, suddenly, shy about voicing dreams that still felt too large for someone who'd spent years with nothing. Willa set down the spoon and moved to stand behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders. "Tell me what you're thinking." Jack leaned back against her warmth, drawing comfort from her presence the way he had since that first desperate night. "I keep thinking about people like us. Folks who need a fresh start, a place to heal, time to figure out what comes next. This land, this community, it could be a sanctuary for people who need sanctuary. Like a way station," Willa said thoughtfully. "A place for people to catch their breath and find their footing, something like that. Nothing formal, nothing that would draw the wrong kind of attention. Just if someone needed help, they'd know they could find it here." It was a dream born from their own experience of desperate need met by unexpected kindness. Jack thought of Sheriff Walsh's willingness to help strangers, of Tom Bradley's generosity with his time and wisdom, of Dr. Patterson's care that extended beyond his patients to their families and futures. "I love it," Willa said simply. "I love the idea of this place being a beginning for other people the way it was a beginning for us." Hope chose that moment to bang her spoon against her high chair, demanding attention with the imperious authority of someone who'd never known a moment of want or fear. They both laughed, and Jack rose to lift his daughter from her chair, swinging her high enough to make her giggle with delight. She wasn't his by blood, but she was his in every way that mattered. When she said "Papa" now, her first word, much to Willa's mock indignation, she meant Jack. When she needed comfort or wanted to play, she reached for him with the same trust she showed her mother. He was her father in truth, and she was his daughter in love. "Your grandmother's coming to visit," he told Hope seriously, as if she could understand every word. "She's gonna love seeing how big you've gotten, how smart you are." Hope babbled, something that might have been agreement, then settled contentedly in his arms, her small fingers playing with the chain of the pocket watch he wore, his father's watch, returned to him by Tom Bradley's kindness and now worn with pride rather than hidden in shame. The morning routine continued around them with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd found their rhythm together. Willa finished cleaning up from breakfast while Jack played with Hope, both of them moving through tasks that had become second nature. It was domestic life at its most ordinary and most precious, the kind of mundane happiness that people who'd never lost everything might take for granted. A knock at the door interrupted their peaceful morning, but it was the kind of knock that spoke of friendship rather than trouble. Sheriff Walsh stood on their doorstep, hat in hand, wearing the slightly awkward expression of a man who had good news but wasn't sure how to deliver it. "Morning, folks," he said, accepting Willa's invitation to come in for coffee. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." "Always welcome," Jack replied, meaning it. Walsh had become not just an ally but a friend, someone whose respect Jack valued and whose counsel he sought on matters both practical and personal. "Got some news I thought you'd want to hear directly," Walsh continued, settling at their table with the ease of a regular visitor. "About Marcus." Jack felt a familiar tightness in his chest at his brother's name, though it was fainter now than it had been. Time and happiness had dulled the sharp edges of that old pain, but Marcus remained a shadow that occasionally darkened sunny days. What about him? Walsh accepted a cup of coffee before answering. Died in prison 3 days ago. Fever, according to the warden. Went quick, they said. The words hung in the air like smoke from a spent fire. Jack felt Willa's hand find his, offering comfort and support, while Hope played contentedly with her wooden rattle, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "I'm sorry for your loss," Walsh said quietly. "I know he was your brother, whatever else he was." Jack nodded slowly, processing emotions he couldn't quite name. Grief, yes, but also relief. And underneath it all, a sadness for what might have been if Marcus had chosen differently. "Thank you for telling us," he said finally. "It's better to know." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Walsh spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "You know what strikes me about all this? Marcus spent his whole life trying to tear down what other people built. You spend yours building up. In the end, that's what matters. Not what we tear down, but what we leave standing." Jack looked around their home, at the evidence of work and love and hope made manifest in wood and stone and growing things. Walsh was right. This was what mattered, not the destruction Marcus had caused, but the life Jack and Willa had built from the ashes of that destruction. "He's at peace now," Willa said softly. "Finally at peace." As Walsh prepared to leave, he paused at the door, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been sheriff in this county for 15 years. Seen a lot of people come and go. Seen families, made and broken, but I've never seen anything quite like what you folks have built here." "What do you mean?" Willa asked. Walsh gestured toward Hope, toward the home they'd created, toward the land visible through their windows. "Most people, when they get knocked down by life, they either stay down or they get up angry. You two got up grateful. That's rarer than you might think." After Walsh left, Jack and Willa spent the rest of the morning working side by side in comfortable silence. He repairing a section of fence while she tended the garden with Hope playing nearby. It was honest work, the kind that left hands dirty and hearts clean, and Jack found in it the same satisfaction his father had once described as the sun reached its zenith, painting their land in shades of gold and green. Jack paused in his work to watch his wife and daughter. Willa was showing Hope how to distinguish between ripe and unripe tomatoes, her voice patient and loving as she guided small hands toward understanding. Hope, now nearly a year old, listened with the serious attention of someone who knew she was learning important things. This was what they'd built from nothing, not just a home or a farm, but a family. A place where love was the foundation, and hope was the roof that kept out the storms. A sanctuary where broken people could heal and lost souls could find their way. In the distance, Jack could see Tom Bradley's wagon approaching, no doubt coming to discuss the land purchase that might expand their little sanctuary. Behind that conversation lay the possibility of helping others the way they'd been helped, of passing forward the kindness that had saved them both. But for now, in this perfect moment of ordinary happiness, Jack Maddox was content to simply stand in the doorway of his home, watching his family grow in the garden they'd planted together, grateful beyond words for the abandoned barn that had become the foundation of everything good in his life. The wooden cross above his head caught the light, and Jack smiled, remembering the desperate souls who'd first carved those words into the barn door so many months ago. They'd been running from their pasts then, seeking nothing more than shelter from the storm. Now they were running toward their future, hands joined and hearts full, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring to their sanctuary of hope.